Greetings and welcome to another fashionably late review here at Words About Games. Amy here, and today I want to talk to you all about Elden Ring. First of all, I'll give out some general information about the game. Elden Ring is an action RPG developed by From Software and published by Bandai Namco, and was released on February 24th, 2022 on PlayStation 4 and 5, Xbox One, Xbox Series S and X, and PC via Steam. According to the game's store description, rise tarnished and be guided by grace to brandish the power of the Elden Ring and become an Elden Lord in the lands between. So I'll start with my general thoughts on the game before diving into a few of my more in-depth impressions. All of this video will be spoiler free, and we'll have a longer discussion video coming out sometime next week where we go fully in-depth on the game. So if you want to hear my really in-depth thoughts, look forward to that. So Elden Ring is the game I've spent all 2022 so far looking forward to. Like we joked on the podcast that for me, Elden Ring was really when the new year started. And I've played a couple of pretty cool indie games in the first couple of months of 2022, but yeah, Elden Ring is the first game that's really captured my attention and held it for a significant period of time. 69 hours to be precise. Nice. So I'm a latecomer to the Soulsborne From Software series. Like, after a couple of false starts over the years trying to get into Dark Souls and Bloodborne, I streamed Bloodborne when I was furloughed back in 2020. Wow, remember furlough? And it quickly became one of my favorites of all time. Like, I quickly jumped into Demon Souls PS5 remake afterwards, which I also loved, and the Dark Souls remastered, which I wasn't a massive fan of, but then I also demolished Dark Souls 3 last year, and I absolutely loved that game too. I'm setting up this context because I've not only been asked my opinion on Elden Ring over the past month, but also as someone who has played and loved previous FromSoft games, where I'd rank Elden Ring as part of the quote-unquote series, if series is even an appropriate way to describe the run of games that started with Demon Souls on PS3, which I think that it is, given how similar all of the games feel to one another. If nothing else, Elden Ring can definitely be described as a spiritual successor to Dark Souls. So the question is generally phrased like this: is Elden Ring your new favourite From Software game? And the answer is yes. And also no. It's a complicated one. Before I really dive into explaining my answer, I do feel like I should point out that my entire playthrough took place on the launch version of the game, before the patch that brought with it some pretty big nerfs to certain weapons, abilities, and playstyles. I mostly avoided the cheesier strategies in Elden Ring, not because I was trying to play the way the developers intended or any such nonsense, but just from a general lack of knowledge surrounding some of the game's more broken mechanics. I did cheese one annoying boss through research, more on that later, and I used some of the launch version's more overpowered abilities, specifically the Cerulean Tier plus Comet Azure combo and the fully upgraded Mimic Tier. Not because I'd read that they were OP, more just I explored every nook and cranny of the world and I found some mechanics that seemed to work really well. Which actually gives me the perfect segue into the yes part of the answer to the question, is Elden Ring the best From Software game yet? Because that mostly stems from the open world, or more specifically, the way in which FromSoft have implemented and designed the lands between, which is the huge world that you'll spend your time exploring. There's an absurd amount of really cool and awesome places to visit in Elden Ring, and a whole heap of secrets to uncover. The lands between almost instantly jumps to the top of my list of favourite open worlds I've ever explored. If you've listened to me talk about games for the past few years, then you'll know that I've been kinda done with open worlds recently. Even just having a game set in an open world has been sort of a turn-off for me. I've only really stuck with a few open world games that I've really gotten into in the past few years, like Spider-Man and Halo Infinite. But if I'm being really honest, I stuck with and loved those games in spite of their open worlds, because there were other reasons that I rolled credits on them that had nothing to do with the worlds themselves. Elden Ring felt different almost immediately. Like, after the obligatory opening boss fight that kills you and a short tutorial, you imagine Limgrave, you're given some vague directions, and you're generally just unleashed upon a gigantic open world that's yours to explore however you see fit, and more or less in whatever order you desire. There's a huge amount of this world that's open to you without the need to fight your way through any of Elden Ring's legacy dungeons and major bosses that dwell within, most of whom, all of whom, can be tackled in just about any order you want. It was a genuine joy simply exploring the world, and it honestly feels like a surprise to say that. One of my favourite aspects of both Bloodborne and Dark Souls 3 are their intricately constructed series of levels that interconnect while still being fairly linear. And given how much I've not been enjoying open world content recently, I gotta say I was apprehensive about the idea of having to explore another massive open space. I needn't have worried. I mean, for starters, FromSoft have taken the opportunity to craft some truly breathtaking, stunning vistas in extraordinarily memorable areas that I won't mention here, but I'm looking forward to gushing over it in a longer review discussion. While Elden Ring's graphics aren't the most powerful or whatever, the art direction and world design are impeccable. You're going to be visiting a lot of places which are stunning to look at and wander about in, and it's not an exaggeration to say that a couple of moments literally took my breath away. Like there was one location reveal that I won't spoil here, which literally my jaw hit the floor. There's a true sense of discovery in Elden Ring that I don't think I've really found in many other open world games. Like, I get that a lack of a quest log or map markers has been a hot talking point recently, but honestly, they really fueled the sense that I was exploring a place. This game has made me realize that one of the reasons I don't get into many open world games are those detailed quest logs and map markers. Like, I feel less like I'm exploring or going on an adventure, and more like I'm bouncing between objective markers on my way to check off whatever's next on the list. And I'm not knocking the idea of quest logs and objective markers. I think there's definitely a middle ground to be struck between Elden Ring's approach and that of, say, Horizon. I know that the latest patch introduced map markers that show where you last saw a specific NPC, and maybe a journal or quest log that reminded you of conversations you'd had with NPCs would be helpful. Just something to help jog your memory or nudge you in the right direction when you need it. I don't know, I'm not a game designer, and I always try to avoid giving the impression that I know better than the team that built their game. Nor do I want to start writing elaborate fanfiction about the game that Elden Ring could have been. I'll save my fanfiction writing for my Rani fanfic series. While I almost assuredly missed some or a lot of quest steps or NPCs in their entirety, which does suck because doing NPC quests has always been a big part of my enjoyment in these games, particularly when I played Dark Souls 3, I feel like if Elden Ring had led me around its world too much, it would have killed some of the wonder and awe and just pure joy I felt in just getting lost and exploring. Knowing I needed to go in a general direction and then getting distracted by the caves, churches, ruins, forts, dragons, and whatever else I found along the way, none of which are signposted or dropped on your map by climbing a tower or picking up a map fragment. It all came together to create a genuinely engaging sense of exploration and gave me a feeling I haven't felt since I don't even remember. Maybe Morrowind? And on top of an amazing open world, From Software have allowed me to have my cake and eat it too with their legacy dungeons, which are massive areas that make up the connecting dots between the main bosses that you'll be fighting and killing on your way to becoming Elden Lord. These legacy dungeons are reminiscent of some of the most memorable levels of previous Soulsborne games, where the open world is designed to be a vast, sprawling landscape for you to get lost in. These dungeons are intricately designed and self-contained, leading you on a sprawling, interconnected path from their beginning to whatever main boss resides at their conclusion. Basically, Elden Ring is open world Dark Souls that is punctuated by designs and dungeons that represent classic Dark Souls level design, which is the part that I would call my favorite From Software game. For me personally, they nailed the open world in a way that totally caught me off guard. And then just as I was getting over that revelation, I walked into Stormveil Castle and found a dungeon level that had been designed akin to the best levels of the previous games. I think in the game critique world, we call that a win-win. There's other cool stuff tied to the open world and a fresh approach to level design. Chief amongst them are the newly implemented stakes of Marika, which for a Soulsborne veteran like myself are an absolute godsend. You'll typically find these posted up outside boss arenas, and they allow you to respawn there instead of at a site of grace, circumventing one of the most annoying parts of previous FromSoft games, the long run back to the boss fight after you get stomped into the ground. It probably seems like a small thing, but honestly, for me, it was a game changer and a welcome relief to be able to more or less instantly have another run at a boss fight without needing to run past a gauntlet of enemies just to have another go. Torrent is also really cool. Like, considering this is FromSoft's first horse, they pretty much nailed the mechanics, at least for traversal and exploration on horseback, something that not every studio manager's first time. Looking at you, Roach. Fighting on horseback felt a little janky to me, and it wasn't something I really engaged with where I didn't absolutely have to, but exploring with Torrent was great. And whoever's idea it was to give Torrent a double jump deserves a raise. Although, judging from the reports that have come out recently, everyone at your studio deserves a raise, FromSoft. And better working conditions. I want to briefly touch on a couple of other things before I move on to my next main talking point. The side dungeons that you'll find littering the lands between are fairly cool. I'm glad they're not the sole focus of your exploration, as they're not amazing, and the further into the game you go, the more samey they do start to feel. And the boss fights, which I class as mini bosses when compared to the major fights you'll find yourself in, are fine. None of them are really standout. There's some cool monster designs, a couple of really nice feeling fights, but nothing I found in a side dungeon ever really felt hugely stand out to me. I also want to shout out the music and sound design, which are both exceptional. I've been desperately waiting for the Elden Ring OST release so I can listen on repeat a few dozen times, but it definitely feels like it could rival Bloodborne's OST for my favourite FromSoft soundtrack. So with all that being said, I guess how come I said yes and no to the question of whether Elden Ring was my favourite From Software game of all time? And the answer is the boss fights, the main boss fights. With there being like 100 plus bosses in Elden Ring, and even a lot of the major bosses being optional, it's hard to figure out the best term to use to even describe them. The ones you generally find in legacy dungeons or by completing the more in-depth NPC quests, I guess is probably a good way of describing them. I guess I could look up other reviews to see what they call them, but I don't read reviews until after I've done my own, so we're going to stick with major bosses. The boss fights are the most memorable things about From Software games. I don't think that's a controversial thing to say. I talked extensively about this in my Dark Souls 3 retrospective last year, talking about the really good, awesome, satisfying boss fights, or the bullshit, annoying, aggravating ones, or just the ones that were kind of meh. And which will depend on who you ask, is kind of how a lot of fans of the series talk to one another. So while I was really, really enjoying exploring the open world and legacy dungeons of the game, I kind of feel like a lot of the bosses missed the mark somewhat in Elden Ring. I mean, there were a few really good major boss fights here, and there were a handful that I genuinely hated, but there were a surprising number I'd throw into that meh category. Like, if you ask me to talk about them in any great or specific detail, I'll have trouble doing that because quite a few of them were pretty unmemorable. Now, I am saying this relative to having played a few of FromSoft's previous games. Even the boss fights I'd describe as fine but a bit unsatisfying are probably still better than you'd find in a lot of other games. But context is kind of important, and I was kind of disappointed by a decent chunk of the major boss fights in Elden Ring. Not disappointed enough to invalidate the thousands of words I'd just spent gushing about how special and great this game is, mind you, thanks to the combat, which I'll dive into shortly, being impeccable. Again, though, there are a few really excellent boss fights in here that, while I don't think necessarily stack up against the absolute best fights from Soulswell's game past, are really satisfying to learn and beat. I don't really want to dive into talking about my feelings on the boss fights too specifically because I promised no spoilers, so I'm going to save the specifics for my longer discussion video next week. I do want to specifically talk about one of the bosses that I hated and how I beat it, which I feel is safe to do because the latest patch nerfed the cheese strategy that I used to get past it. If you followed people talking about the game, then you've probably heard about the Fire Giant, a mandatory boss fight you have to beat towards the end of the game. One that I raged about in a thread on Twitter, and a boss fight that might be the worst I've experienced in a Soulsborne game to date. I hated everything about this fight and my life in general until I googled how to cheese my way past it. Like, I was worried that it was going to be the thing that stopped me from even finishing Elden Ring. It frustrated me to the point that I literally looked up a strategy that just let me lead the bastard off a cliff twice to kill him with full damage instead of engaging in the fight the way it was intended. And if I hadn't have done that, I probably wouldn't have made it any further into the game. There were like 4 fights in Elden Ring that really pushed the limit of my patience and had me question how much I actually wanted to keep playing. And when I beat each of these fights, I didn't feel any sense of satisfaction that I'd overcome a powerful opponent. All I felt was relief that I was past the bullshit and I could move on and start enjoying the game again. Like, hard fights are a thing in Elden Ring and they're a thing in Soulsborne games, and that's fine, and I love a good hard fight, but there were these boss fights that just took it to another level that were just annoying and nothing else. The Fire Giant fight also highlights something else that really annoyed me about a lot of Elden Ring's boss fights in general. Quite a few of Elden Ring's boss fights have multiple phases. If you've played a Souls game or a Bloodborne game before, you probably won't be surprised by that, but a really annoying trick Elden Ring employs is to have you totally deplete a boss's health bar, play a cutscene, and then refill that boss's health bar, and now you have to fight the boss's next phase, and if you die, you have to repeat both phases of the fight. And Elden Ring pulls this trick so many times, it really started to piss me off as this game kept going. Okay, so I'm done talking in specifics about the boss fights. Instead, I want to gush about the combat. sort of. Elden Ring's combat feels a lot like previous FromSoft games, which is a good thing, but it's also something I've dissected twice before in previous retrospectives, and I feel like I've exhausted just about everything I have to say about it. Basically, it's amazing. Ever since I really got to grips with Bloodborne, I've been in love with the gameplay style of these games, and Elden Ring is no exception. There's just something so viscerally satisfying about how this game feels to play, and the combat is a huge component of that. For the most part, no matter the size or power of my opponent, combat is a genuine thrill that I don't think I could have gotten tired of, bullshit bosses aside. I did play Elden Ring with a sorcery focused class, which is a big departure from my usual melee focused dodge rolling builds, and I actually really love doing that. Combat in Elden Ring feels very rhythmic and almost puzzle like, and once you get it, it can really suck you in. But instead of trying to find 20 synonyms for the word amazing to keep saying the same thing but slightly differently, I'll lavish praise on a couple of new additions to Elden Ring that make fights feel really cool and will undoubtedly be a help to the many players for who Elden Ring is their first experience of a FromSoft game. One of them will be a guest on our review discussion next week, which are the Ashes of War and the Spirit Ashes. I know Dark Souls 3 had weapon arts, which kind of likes Ashes of War, but I feel like there's enough of a distinction between the two things to call them new. So both of these things are actually really fucking great. Exploration will yield you a huge variety of both, and you can use them to give you a helping hand or enhance your own fighting style. As a squishy sorceress, I found any spirit ashes that summon tanky melee fighters incredibly helpful, because having an enemy's full attention wasn't always great. Though, paradoxically, spirits can also sometimes make boss fights harder by making the enemy AI more unpredictable in certain moments. I also want to give a shout out to the fully upgraded Mimic tier, which saved my ass quite a few times. Ashes of War are abilities that you can find throughout the world that you can equip to some of your weapons to give you access to a spell or ability, and can even change the property of a weapon to allow it to scale its damage differently and make it something more suited to your playstyle or build. For example, in the early game, I slotted one into a normal longsword that changed it to a magic longsword, making its damage scale with my intelligence and allowing it to be much more useful to my character and my build. I didn't really use the ashes themselves too much since I already had a suite of sorceries at my disposal, and the one I did use a couple of times in the really late game got nerfed into the ground by the latest patch. Rest in peace, Hoarfrostomb. You were too beautiful for this world. As for a couple of other minor criticisms I have of the game, I didn't really get the purpose of the crafting system. Well, I mean, I get the purpose of it, to craft things, but I don't think I ever actually used it, and it kind of felt unnecessary. You find or buy cookbooks through your travels that expand what you can craft, but by the halfway point, I kind of forgot the item crafting menu even existed. Like, outside of the first hour or two of the game, I literally don't think I even opened the menu. It feels superfluous, like it was included because it's a thing that exists in most open world RPGs, but then never really expanded upon in any meaningful way. I'd also say that the UI in Elden Ring could do with some work. It's mostly unchanged from its predecessors, which some have used as a defense of its unchanging nature, but I think it's time for a rethink. It's oftentimes clunky and quite unintuitive in relatively minor ways, but ways that add up when you're grappling with it for 69 hours. I'm talking about things like having items you pick up through a huge pop-up in the middle of your screen that you have to manually clear with a button push, or having the map open button be different from the map closing button, or the absolute mess that is the inventory screen. Like, none of this is a deal breaker in any way, but a few quality of life improvements could make a fairly significant difference to the end user experience. And those are my thoughts on Elden Ring, a game which is simultaneously my favorite From Software game and also, not my favorite From Software game, but still amazing. The open world and the way it's been designed and executed upon is a genuine marvel that I've loved exploring as much as I could, and I think it's fair to say that it's probably one of the best open worlds I've ever explored. Even after 69 hours, I could easily have gone on for another 69 to really explore every last corner of the lands between. And although I found some of the boss fights to be really good but slightly underwhelming, the impeccable combat mechanics more than make up for it. Like, it's only April, but I feel like for me, Elden Ring is going to be a tough game to beat when it comes to our Game of the Year talk in 2022. And if you want to hear me talk more in detail about the game with full spoilers enabled, check out our longer review discussion, which should be hitting YouTube sometime next week. Well, that's it for this review. Let us know what you think of the game. Did you like it? Are you somewhere in the middle? Or was it something that wasn't for you? Leave a comment down below. You know where the comments are on YouTube. Or hit me up on Twitter. All the info is in the description. I'm going to get out of here because I have tons more games to play, especially after spending a month playing Elden Ring. And there is not enough time in the day. So I will see you next time.